Privilege of welcoming Professor Stephen Ball to give a keynote. I have a very short bio, Stephen. It will be too short, but just to leave you more time for your speech in particular. So Stephen Ball is the Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology of Education at the Institute of Education, UCL, University College London. He was elected Fellow of the British Academy in 2006, and he's also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and the Society of Educational Studies. His main areas of interest are in sociology-informed education policy and the relationship between education policy and social class. He has published numerous books, 20 at least, published in 140 journals, and he's the co-founder and managing editor of the Journal of Education Policy. Thank you very much for being with us. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you today. If I can find something to talk to. There are lots of things I would like to say in a very short time, and as the conference has proceeded, the list of things I want to say has become even longer. But on the other hand, some of the things I was going to say, at least in the form of background, have been said by other people, so I can draw upon things that they said in order to make things a little shorter. Still not operating here, so let's try again.
You've only got a background slide. This is not. Which one is it?
This is the one, that one there.
There we go.
Thank you. The first thing that is important for me to say is that in many ways I'm not particularly interested in philanthropy. Philanthropy is not the point of my work. I'm interested in philanthropy as a case of, and I'm interested in philanthropy in relation to a set of much broader issues and concerns which have informed my work over a long period of time. So I'm interested in philanthropy in relation to and as a case of issues of educational governance and democracy, and in particular in relation to changing forms and modalities of the state. I'm interested in the role and forms and modalities of the state. I'm also interested in the policy process, and I'm interested in philanthropy again as a case of the participation of new voices in policy work. So I'm interested in the who's, the where's and the how's of policy and the role of philanthropy in those who's, where's and how's. And finally also I'm interested in philanthropy in relation to broader global processes of educational reform and a global agenda of reform. So in this respect I'm interested in what we might call a political economy of philanthropy. And specifically, I'm interested in big philanthropy and the entanglements and constitution of philanthropy, mutual constitution of philanthropy and business, of reform and profit, of personal visions and education policy. And I realise, and other people have talked about and made the point, that this is not the be-all and end-all of philanthropy. There are other forms of philanthropy of a variety of kinds, and in some ways this is a minority aspect of philanthropy in terms of the amount of money involved. But in many other ways, these big philanthropies punch above their weight in terms of the effects and implications that they can have from their investments in the area of education and elsewhere. So I'm going to talk about some of the issues related to governance, related to policy processes, and related to education reform by focusing on a particular philanthropy, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, as an exponent of what people have already talked about and explained as impact investing. And in relation to Michael and Susan Dell, I'm also going to take up a particular focus on India. And in all of this, I'm also going to worry away at some of the issues that have been raised, particularly yesterday, in terms of the neatness of our analysis and the development of typologies. And I want to question and trouble the notion of typologies as the useful way forward in terms of the kind of work that we're doing here. What I'm going to talk about builds upon an iteration of studies around business and philanthropy, which goes back about 15 years and a longer history of work on the state and governance. But in particular, a set of books, Education PLC, Networks, New Governance and Education, Global Education Inc., and then most recently this year, the latest iteration of this, Education.net. So what I'm talking about today moves on from work that was discussed in Education.net. I also wanted to say, but I haven't got time to say this, that despite the references yesterday that Prashi and Robin made, I don't do social network analysis. I do something that I call network ethnography, which is importantly different in many ways, although there is an overlap between them. But as I say, I don't have the space to talk about that. So philanthropy is important because it brings new voices and visions into the space of education. It constructs new places in which education policy is done. It brings new methods and languages and sensibilities and values into the world of education policy. And it is also related to changes in and the formation of a new kind of state and new forms of governance, what we might call heterarchy, or what Bob Jessup calls meta-governance. And that's what I'm interested in. So I'm going to, as I say, talk a bit about the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, say something in 2 minutes about the US, not say anything at all about England, and then home in on India. And all of this is set within the framework which was explained yesterday of the shift in the nature of philanthropic activity, from what's sometimes called philanthropy 1.0 to philanthropy 2.0 to philanthropy 3.0. 3.0 being the importation of business techniques into philanthropy with the possibility of doing well by doing good. As Ted Turner put it, or claims, certain areas of making the world better do lend themselves very comfortably to for-profit operations. And this has become an accepted premise now for philanthropy 3.0, impact philanthropy, venture philanthropy, whatever one might call it. And this is what Bill Gates calls creative capitalism, using capitalism, competition, the market, to solve the world's social problems. So he, in fact, argues that companies should be given recognition for their engagement with social problems, and that companies should compete with one another, not simply on the basis of sales or income, but also who can do the most good. So again, the idea is you can do good by doing well. Or as Vinod Khosla puts it, Vinod Khosla, the founder of Sun Systems, who will crop up later, investors, entrepreneurs, and business can create wealth for themselves by providing value to the masses. So what's happening in here with this relationship between profit and social problems is, as Shamir puts it, that philanthropy is beginning to assume some of the socio-moral duties that were heretofore assigned to civil society organizations, government entities, and state agencies. So we're not simply privatizing aspects of policy. We're not simply privatizing aspects of the public sector. We're not simply privatizing aspects of the functioning of the state. We're actually privatizing morality in this respect. So this is a change which operates on a number of levels, that it's not simply economic. This is a kind of ambitious philanthropy. For people like Bill Gates, it's a form of world making. Business values and methods work for them, and they take the view that they should therefore work for the public sector and for philanthropy. And as Sarah Radcliffe puts it, this is bigger, bolder philanthropy, or as somebody termed it yesterday, muscular philanthropy. And it's also strategic. Again, this was commented yesterday, and I'll come back to this in a moment. If you look at the MSDF website, what they talk about in terms of what they're trying to do is that they're systematically seeking to transform the education system in the cities and countries of operation. So they're not funding simply programs, they're not supporting particular initiatives, although they are doing that, but they're also aiming to transform whole systems. This is not modest philanthropy. This is ambitious, strategic, world-making philanthropy, aiming to change whole systems. And it's also, in some respects, and again I come back to this, a kind of antagonistic philanthropy with very complex relationships to and against the state. And as an aside, I shouldn't really say this, I haven't got the time to say it, but I was talking about these issues in Copenhagen 2 weeks ago and having a look at the Lego Foundation. And interestingly, on their website, they also claim to be seeking to transform, in this case, attitudes and behaviours about learning and play across society. The interesting thing about Lego is that their agenda of reform is entirely different from that of Michael and Susan Dell and Bill Gates. They're not interested in digitalization, they're not interested in measurement, they're not interested in testing, they're interested in play. So what this points up, interestingly, is a relationship between vision and commercial interest. In Lego's sense, the commercial interest lies in selling more Lego, and that relates to play in the classroom rather than testing. But as I said, an aside. And some of this is working in particular places to do very significant things. The combination of Broad, Gates, Robertson, Walmart and other major MacArthur foundations in the United States has changed almost entirely the school systems of Chicago, New Orleans, Oakland, Washington, D.C., Memphis and others. They have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into these school systems with the effect of changing them fundamentally in terms of how they're organized, how they run, pedagogy, curriculum, the infrastructure of schools, the role of leadership, etc. So these things can make an enormous impact in particular places. In a way, we must neither underestimate nor overestimate the effects of big philanthropy. And you may have seen that 2013 there was a survey done in the United States and 300 leading educators were asked to name who they thought the most influential educator in the United States was. And by far and away the most commonly named person was Bill Gates, which if you think about it is extraordinary. That if you ask 300 leading educators who's the most influential educational thinker, it's Bill Gates. He has no elected position. He has no role in terms of civil society. He simply has lots and lots of money. And Michael Petrelli puts it's not unfair to say that the Gates Foundation agenda has become the country's agenda in education. So let me look at some of this in relation to the work of Bill and Melinda Gates. Susan and Michael Dell. So they get in everywhere. Susan and Michael Dell. There's Michael and Susan, and there's Susan. She also has a fashion house, and that's her modelling one of her creations. And the Gates Foundation was founded in the 1990s. It operates in 3 localities in the United States, in South Africa and India, and it's not by chance that it operates in those 3 places. And we've seen already from various analysis that people have done that India and South Africa are major recipients of philanthropy more generally from various sources. The foundation is a family foundation created by Michael Dell from the money he earned by selling shares in the Dell Corporation when the Dell Corporation was floated on the stock exchange. And he received, he initially made a $50 million donation to the foundation and received the appropriate tax breaks for that. Since that time, MSDF have spent around $1.3 billion in terms of various investments and grants. Michael himself is supposedly the 37th richest man in the world. He still owns 12% of the stock of the Dell Corporation, which is worth $3.5 billion. And he is again now the president and CEO of Dell. And in 2013, Dell was re-privatized. But we're talking about 2 entities here. We're talking about the Dell Corporation and the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. There is also a Dell Foundation, which is the corporate social responsibility wing of the Dell Corporation. But that is entirely separate from the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. So it's important to recognize the distinction between these entities. And MSDF is committed to a very hands-on approach to their investments. And they work closely in multiple relationships with multiple partners. And their approach is data-driven. They're interested in measurement, they're interested in impact, and they're interested in the pragmatic effects of their investment strategies, which are based upon business-minded factors and hard data, and, as they put it, realities on the ground. In practice, Dell operates across the whole of the spectrum of forms of philanthropy that Arushi talked about yesterday. They don't operate in one way. They do make donations of an old-fashioned kind. They also support particular programs undertaken by not-for-profit and social enterprise organizations, but they have a major commitment to impacting investing. So you can't put them in a particular box. You have to look at a whole range of different kinds of activity that they are involved in. And they're involved both in funding local initiatives and businesses of various kinds, as we'll see in a moment, but also they're involved in the export of policy ideas from the US to other locations. And in particular, the particular case in point is the export of their practice, their method of blended learning, which has been developed in charter schools in the United States, in particular KIPP and rocket ship schools. They're now exporting that as an appropriate method and a pedagogy and arrangement for classrooms to South Africa and to India in various ways. So again, they operate both locally and internationally, globally, in terms of how they move funds and how they move ideas. But as I said, they're also involved in donations of various kinds. So recently, they've given $2.3 million to a program in Haryana state in India. The program is aimed to improve the skills of teachers, the learning enhancement program. But as always with these donations, it's important to begin to trace not simply what's given, but how the money is used. So if you trace this money, the money actually goes to the Boston Consulting Group as a fee to manage the LEP program. So this is headline donation by MSDF to Haryana State, but in fact the money is specifically earmarked to pay the Boston Consulting Group to provide management, the management of the program. And Boston Consulting Group and the Centre for Public Engagement, which is the corporate social responsibility arm of the Boston Consulting Group, are key partners of MSDF in a whole number of other activities. What I'm going to draw on is a set of work which is partly based on a network which I've been involved in trying to build over the last 7 years. And this is one small part of the network. We've actually now run out of money, so it's no longer possible to build and maintain the network. So it's sort of aging. Clearly, it's almost impossible to make any sense of that. And there are some iterations, more recent ones, where the screen begins to black out entirely. But it is possible, and what I'm trying to do in recent publications and pieces of analysis is to take slices through the network, or what Eugene McCann calls pipelines, looking at pipelines. So here I'm focusing on some, again, this is only some for the purposes of actually being able to see something sensible, some of the partnerships of Michael and Susan Dell Foundation in India. So this is some of their partners in India, and I'm only going to pick out one or two of those. So they are involved, for example, in 3 investment funds focused on India. There is, in the center at the bottom, IEIF, the Indian Educational Initiative Fund. There is the Mentera Venture Advisors, which is another fund, and the top left-hand corner, the Unitas Seed Fund, which is the one I'm going to concentrate on. And these are known as third-party investment vehicles, and they're funded by a range of partners. So in the case of Unitas, MSDF are partners, but a number of other foundations, and in particular Deshpande and Wadhwani, are Indian diasporic businessmen based in the United States who have founded their own foundations, the Sorensen Impact Foundation, a number of others, and then also individual funders. And these are people operating individually, nothing to do with foundations or Bill and Melinda Gates, etc. But as individuals, people like Bill Gates, Vinod Khosla, and Amazon's Diego Piacentini, they are also individual investors in this fund. And this is what, as Nick mentioned this morning, is sometimes called, Diane Ravitch calls, the Billionaires Boys Club. They're using their money to invest in new startup opportunities. And India is a particularly attractive location for such investment. Not the least because it is the fastest growing economy in the world. The opportunities for both business and for innovation are enormous. And there are attractions to the Indian government for their openness to these kinds of investments, inasmuch that they are requiring the development of an enormous level of skills in relation to economic expansion. And they also are facing an incredible demand for education at all levels. India is also the youngest country in the world. It has the highest number and the highest percentage of population between the ages of 17 and 24 of any country in the world. And basically, the Indian state cannot afford to provide education, particularly beyond compulsory level, for its population. It's simply unsustainable economically. And in that sense, there is an opportunity, there is a policy window here for investors who might become interested in education, both as a philanthropic and a business opportunity. So there's been enormous growth in impact investing in India. Several billions of dollars have already been invested in the field of education and in health and sustainability and elsewhere. And as Anand Sudarshan, who's founder and director of Sylvant Advisors, who I'll come back to in a moment, a partner with MSDF and the Unitas Seed Fund, as he puts it, India is at a unique point in human history with an extraordinary size and proportion of youth. We're seeking the best entrepreneurial energy and commitment to participate in this opportunity. So Unitas and Michael and Susan Dell, because alongside Unitas, I've already said Michael and Susan Dell are involved in 2 other investment funds. They also operate independently to invest in particular businesses, like, for example, Report B, which is a testing business which is growing at great speed in India, and Michael and Susan Dell have made a direct $50 million investment in Report B. But also these are different kinds of investments. They're involved in capital investments, what are called bootstrap or mezzanine investments, and also equity investments, and several kinds of different forms of equity investment. And one of the things that we have to come to grips with if we're going to research these fields is that we have to begin to understand these. We can talk about impact investing, but that's a broad generic term for a whole range of forms of different kinds of investment. So it may be that in some cases, as they do, Michael and Susan Dell take an equity, a portion of equity from the companies they invest in. On other occasions, they simply provide temporary bootstrapping investment, or in other cases, they're simply providing some form of capital investment, which they will expect to have returned to them at some point in time. But those nuances are important to understand. And as researchers, policy researchers, educational researchers, it's important now that we don't simply read the pages, the public policy pages, we also read the financial pages. We also look at what is happening in terms of the stock market. Those things are as important now as are the policies of governments in terms of understanding education. So Unitas has at present about 14 investments, and 4 of these are in education at the moment. Labinap, which is a virtual laboratory which can be used by schools and teachers and potentially individual students to do science experiments. Hippocampus, which is a private kindergarten system. QMath, which is a franchised maths tutorial program, which involves women working in their own homes, doing tutorial work on maths with about groups of 6 to 8 children, and they buy into the franchise and the materials are all provided for them. And Curiosity, which is a curating site aimed at private schools in India, and it curates curriculum materials that are drawn from around the world and then organized and provided for private schools. If you look at the websites of these investments and the others which are not directed towards education, then one of the interesting things about them is they have a very similar format. They have a standard format which is provided by Unitas, in fact. And they all contain either directly or indirectly criticisms of the Indian state and Indian state education. So Curiosity talks about dismal learning outcomes over a continued period of time in these schools has led to a massive shift towards a private, affordable private schools. And then it goes on to talk about the growth in the number of private schools in India, and the expected number in 2022 to be 130,000 private schools. And in their other activities, Michael and Susan Dell also fund and support private school systems. But at the same time, they also operate in partnerships with municipalities to fund schemes which involve contracting out state schools. And at the same time, they are also partners in the contracting out of those state schools. That is to say, they're involved in as partners in running state schools on contract to municipal governments. So they operate in all of that way, all of those different ways. And again, it's important not to gloss over that in seeking to categorize or typologize the work of Michael and Susan Dell and their various activities. They're also, in terms of the multiple partners they're involved with in India, they also have a relationship through Unitas with Sylvant advisors to run a nationwide startup competition called StartEdu. And this is a competition which aims to identify promising educational startup companies, particularly ed-tech startups. And ed-tech dominates many of the investment activities of both Unitas and Michael and Susan Dell. In some ways for obvious reasons, but I'll come back to that in a moment. And StartEdu is now in its third or fourth cycle. And this involves programs where business groups who are involved in attempting to found startup programs in education, startup business in education, pitch their ideas to a team, and then winners are chosen who receive either support in the form of advice or, to some extent, directly or indirectly, funding. So Lab in App was one of the winners of the previous iteration, and as a result of that, it received funding from Unitas. It also receives funding from some of the partners in Unitas directly in other ways. Sylvant Partners is also a management advisory company which works with educational businesses, and it is also trying to develop an infrastructure to support these businesses in a variety of ways. And it is in itself interesting. The key partners are Anandan Sudarshan, who we've heard from before, who was formerly the CEO of Mandipal Global Education. Mandipal Global Education is the largest education business in India and runs, among many other things, a chain of private universities in India and elsewhere. Madan Padaki, who I'm particularly interested in and in writing another paper about, focused on him. He's the founder and former CEO of MeritTrack, which is a testing company, and co-founder of Head Held High Services, which aims to develop vocational and presentational skills among school leavers. And thirdly, VP Bokasam, who is a serial entrepreneur and general partner in Novak Biddle Venture Partners in the US. And Novak Biddle Venture Partners is the largest private equity investor in education in the United States. So these individuals and their various companies and organizations and their relationships with NSDF and other partners involve complex links between global actors and local actors at a whole range of levels, from very modest startups that involve one or two people in a room with a computer developing an app, to massive global education businesses. And there's the Sylvant website. Sylvant Investors provides robust scaffolding for the future of education to be crafted globally by leveraging the power of experts, depth of insights, and network of entrepreneurs. There's some work of literary analysis to be done on these websites. I enjoy the language that is often used in relation to these particular businesses. And there's the StartEdu competition and the latest application site for that. What does all this suggest in terms of how we think about philanthropy? I think we have to recognize that philanthropy is a sliding signifier in relation to all of this. It means a variety of things. It means different things in different contexts, and it needs to be unpacked. In this case, what we're looking at is philanthropy in the relation to the creation and support and funding and growth of new markets and opportunities for profit, which are being sought in what's called, in the language of this community, the education space. And in all of this, there are very complex and sometimes awkward and endogenous, exogenous relations between various angel investors, the people who are interested in putting money into these startups, and the state, and those relationships can involve various forms of opportunity. The state creates the infrastructure within which it is then possible to operate these competitions, within which it is possible to make profit, in partnership with the state in relation to certain programs, but also, as I've tried to indicate, over and against the state in terms of a critical relationship to the state's own provision of education. So that involves another level of complexity. It also involves the transformation of expertise within this space. It's a displacement, in a sense, of traditional forms of educational expertise, those which some of us may have at some point sought to bring to bear upon education in terms of pedagogy or practice or learning of various kinds. This expertise is now drawn from the world of business and the world of management. If you look at the background of almost all of the actors involved in the education startups, and indeed the funders, they come almost exclusively and entirely from either or both a business management, business school, and technology background. Almost none of them have any background whatsoever in terms of educational experience. But it also has to be said that within all this, the state, and certainly as far as India and South Africa are concerned, is not of a piece. The national state in India is very facilitative, so are some of the individual states, but not all individual states are facilitative of these developments in India. And the same is true in South Africa. 2 of the South African provinces are particularly supportive of these kinds of initiatives, but not all of the South African provinces. And if one looks at India and at South Africa, almost all of these initiatives are aimed at or take place in urban settings rather than rural settings, although, of course, one of the arguments for technology and digitalization of education is that it can be accessed by rural as well as urban students. But Michael and Susan Dell Foundation primarily aim their investments at urban settings and the problem of what they call the urban poor. So I would want to argue that what is happening here is very complex, and it's important to hold on to that complexity. This is a complex and multifaceted space, and I think it is topologically different and opposed to to typological purisms. So I would want to argue that the way forward in terms of analysis is not categories and typologies, it is actually complexity. We must hold on to the messiness of all of this, the multifacetedness of all of this. It's not easy to say, multifacetedness. And think also about the various paradoxes, contradictions, or more neutrally what I would call doubles involved in all of this. So the process of educational reform, as it's related to the activities of Michael and Susan Dell, who are aiming to transform whole education systems, is fourfold in a sense. The process of reform itself opens up the opportunities for profit. But at the same time, the reform process creates opportunities for profit, inasmuch that Michael and Susan Dell, alongside almost every other big philanthropist, sees reform as based upon 2 programmatic bases, which are testing and digitalization. And testing and digitalization as processes of reform create their own profit opportunities. So companies like Report B can make enormous amounts of money by offering testing services to schools and states and cities. And of course, if you do testing and if you want to use apps, then you also need computers. And you might want to turn to one of the world's now not the largest, but second or third largest seller of computers, which just happens to be, of course, the Dell Corporation, which is now has bought and merged with an Indian company called EMC to produce the largest digital corporation in the world. So there's a dual level to the role of profit here. But there's also a third level. The third level is the transformation of the system as one which is driven by and organized around commercialism. And that also creates a number and continuing expansion of for-profit opportunities. So there's the creation of new markets, but at the same time, another double, the creation of new consumers in a variety of ways, through the experience of digitalization at school, or by the use of particular apps, or by the attraction of particular brands. There's also, as I've tried to suggest, a double in terms of different kinds of relationships with the state, operating endogenously within the state to bring about transformations, as in Haryana, but also exogenally operating against the state to create a shadow infrastructure as an alternative to and over and against the state. So in that way, there's another double involved here, the formation of a kind of shadow state. And all of this is founded on the double I started with, the idea of doing well by doing good. So I think we have to hang on to these complexities as well. And we also have to recognize in particular the role of digital opportunities in all of this. And it's no surprise that UNITAS and the other funds received the majority of their initial funding from what are called digital investors. People like Kostler, people like Gates, people like Dell. Because they see the opportunities that may emerge from a technology enabled future. But what is happening in relation to all of that is that the changes affecting schools are not simply changes in relation to organization, it's also changes in relation to the meaning of education, what it means to be educated, what it means to teach and learn. The sensibilities and values of education are also being changed in relation to this. And so are the subjects of education. What it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a learner, are being changed in the process of all of this. So what I'm trying to suggest here is what we have is a re-territorialization of the state. It's not that the state is being deprived of its capacity to manage its systems. Rather, it's being offered the possibility of new and different kinds and modalities of system management. It's not simply a hollowing out, it's also the creation of new forms of power relations open to the state. The state as a monitor, the state as a commissioner, the state as a benchmarker, the state as an infrastructure creator for the activities of other actors. But in all of this, there is the emergence of new governing spaces, new microspaces of governance. Some of these are private spaces, some of these are profitable spaces, and as I've tried to suggest, some of these are personal spaces. So my argument here is A, we need to trace down the specifics of investment to particular programs and how they play out through the activities of particular funds. But also we have to retain in all of that a sense of the messiness and complexity and dynamism of this field of activity. Thank you very much.
Since we are live streaming this, and Stephen will have a few questions if you agree now.
Yes.
We're live streaming this, and there's a quite active following there. So people that are looking at us far away, you can also ask questions. Stephen?
If there are any.
Thank you so much, Stephen. You started out saying that it is difficult, or you don't recommend a typology because it's so messy and fuzzy. So I know that OECD Net Forward is here. How would you measure philanthropy or private sector involvement to get a sense of how, or I don't think you would be against measuring at all, but how would you measure that in, how they are intertwined? What should the OECD that is interested in private development assistance do in order to measure?
I think the problem is that we're kind of rushing to measurement, rushing to typologies without doing the basic research, without looking at the cases. So this involves skimming over various forms of complexity. I mean, for example, I despite their own self-representation, Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, on their website, they talk about themselves as catalytic investors, and they are impact investors. But they do so much more than that. And that is not the sum or be-all of their activities. And if you want to look at how they spend their money, you have to break it down and think about it in a whole variety of different ways. So if you simply then are looking to calculate, and you say, Michael and Susan Dell, impact investors, $1.23 billion. So we put that in that box. That's simply wrong. That is only part of the way in which they spend some of that money. They do a lot of other things as well. And also at the same time, in terms of attempting to think about these things in quantitative terms, we also skim over the other kinds of work that is being done by, for example, MSDF. They're not simply investing in particular programs which may have certain outcomes that can be measured in terms of learning effects, which is what they aim to do. Although if you look at their website, the actual evaluations are very elusive. Some of them are there, but very few, in fact. But if you think about it simply in those terms, which is the way that, again, they present themselves, that they're putting money in particular programs and they want to see the effect of that money in terms of learning outcomes, you're actually missing out a whole range of other things, which is their contribution to shifts in terms of forms of governance, their contribution to the formation of new kinds of educational subjects, their contribution to the formation of a new kind of privatized educational infrastructure, and their contribution to the formation of a new form of sensibility and values and meaning around education. So if we're simply counting, I think actually we're missing most of the impact. I would argue that most of the impact at the moment needs to be understood in subjective, qualitative, interpretational terms as regards the impact on education. Because the impact, again, in the language of the community, has enormous spillovers. It's not simply what you invest in, it's the other side effects of your investment in terms of changes in people, in organizations, and in conceptions of what counts as good education.
Hello, thank you very much for the fantastic presentation. I'm Rosa Jolkonen, a PhD social policy student from Oxford. So as we saw, there's a very, very strong focus on this private sector. I'd like to kind of turn it around a little bit. What does the Dell Foundation say about the public sector? What is the role of the state for them in the education sector? What kind of discourse is there? What kind of role does it preserve for them? Thank you.
Yeah. You mean Michael and Susan Dell Foundation? Yes, because the Dell Foundation is different. Sometimes, though, they actually operate in the same spaces. So the Dell Foundation is also investing in or making a donation to Haryana State for this program. They're donating computers, giving computers to Haryana State. Again, what I was trying to suggest was the relationship is a very complex one. So at certain points in time, if you look at particular parts of the MSDF website or particular parts of their activity, for example, Unitas, then they're highly critical of the state. They see the state as having failed in terms of education, and they mobilize various arguments. And it's very much the traditional minarchist, neoliberal criticism. States are a waste of space. They couldn't organize as Milton Friedman put it. If states were in control of the Sahara Desert, we'd soon have a shortage of sand, he said. It's the argument that the private sector can always do things better. So they're highly committed to that in one field of activity. But on the other hand, they're very willing and have a different kind of language when they're actually cooperating with the state or in partnership with the state. So, for example, MSDF, one of the major funders of the Mumbai School Excellence Programme, which is a programme to create English language schools in Mumbai, vaguely modelled on charter schools. But that involves a partnership with the Mumbai municipality. And then they are friendly, cooperative partners. With Haryana, they're very interested in Haryana State. As I've indicated, they're putting money into the LEP program. Again, they're very positive in terms of their engagement with Haryana State. And they talk in different ways. They're also involved with the South Delhi Municipal Corporation in a program to contract out state schools to a partnership of non-state providers. And in that case, they're operating as a direct partner to deliver state services. So they don't speak in one voice all the time. They speak in different ways and act in different ways in relation to the state at different points in time. They're tactical in that respect. So again, you can't simply put them in one box and say this is the relationship of Michael and Susan Dell Foundation to the state. It doesn't work like that. They're much more subtle. They are, as in terms of neoliberal terminology, they are agile. They will respond to opportunities and possibilities as they emerge. They don't take up a single position which is fixed over time. And again, it's important to recognise that. Somebody way over there.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Kappa from People to People, Human People to People. I had a question about gender in this. You mentioned the Billionaire Boys Club. I mean, we know the power of girls' education and also asking little girls, little boys, what do they think about their education from a really early age? You know, what do they think about their future? I'm curious, and you know, a lot of the Giving Pledge, that's mainly men. I'm just curious, with giving trends, is there a difference between, for example, female-led foundations, you know, majority board female, or philanthropy that's driven by, you know, a woman who's made money in business? If there's a difference in the way that philanthropy, you know, women are giving in philanthropy and education versus men, thinking of Silicon Valley, you know, Michael Dell, Bill Gates, these big names, just if there was a difference in how females are giving versus men are giving in this space. Thank you.
Really, I simply can't answer that because, as you say, in the particular areas of philanthropy that I'm looking at, women don't appear. They are not among the richest people in the world for the most part, and they're not involved in technology industry for the most part. So they simply don't appear in this space, hence Diana Ravitch's comment. So we don't know. The response, I think, would be, well, maybe somebody should go out and do some research on women-led philanthropies and explore the possibility that there might be differences in terms of priorities, methods, sensibilities, and values. I think it then becomes, in a way, an empirical question. It's something wonderful topic for a PhD that somebody could do.
I'm Susan Durston. I'm here representing Child to Child. I in this sort of world of quantitative justification, numbers of children reached, etc. I agree with and was very interested in your comment on measuring impact in terms of, in a sense, the transformative agenda, both at community level and in organisations and systems. But I just wonder if you have any advice as to how one makes that case to funders of all types, really, when we're constantly being bombarded with, have you got a randomised control trial? Have you got numbers for scaling up? Because it's really important if activities are to continue in that way.
I think it's very difficult because we're all seduced by and captured within the quantitative paradigm, and the expectation, as you say, is that we respond to that. But my position would be that one needs to make the argument that you may be capturing a certain version of philanthropy and its effects, but at the same time, systematically, you're ignoring and missing what actually may be the fundamental impacts of philanthropy. The quantitative ones may come and go. The programs may come and go. The foundations may come and go. We heard this morning from Hector in our session talking about Intel and its science fairs around the world. Intel's no longer running its science fairs around the world. It's not doing that anymore. But states still have to deliver education to their children. What is left behind and the spillovers, I would want to suggest, that are the things that we need to focus much more on, are the subjective changes, the changes in values and the changes in meaning. It's so often the focus, certainly of Dell and Gates and others, is on structures and outcomes in terms of performance. And little or no attention is paid to what that means in terms of what it means to be educated. And really, we now have no debate at all about what education is for and what should it look like. It's all foregone in relation to, it's about learning outcomes. In a sense, what we're saying is education is about something else. It's not about education at all. It's not about learning. It's about learning outcomes. The whole space of education, what is a good education? What is an educated person? What is an educated citizen? Is an empty space. We just take that for granted. We ignore it. We assume that we understand what's meant by that. I don't think we do at all. I think we've vacated that. So I think there's a profound mismatch between analysis and research and funding and philanthropy and education as a subjective process. Fundamental. And we need to re-establish some possibility of simply talking about what education is for. Maybe it is for learning outcomes. I don't think so. Maybe I'm in a minority of one, but it would be nice to have the debate.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Laura Patil. I wanted to make two quick comments. The first is in regard to the question we had over here about gender, but more specifically, prioritization of these different companies. I worked for Intel for 10 years in their CSR department and did my thesis, my dissertation thesis on the donor logic of Cisco, Intel, Microsoft. And I would say the one thing to remember is that these are not education companies. And that's very important to remember when you're looking at the prioritization that they have, because Cisco as a networking company is going to act very differently than Microsoft as a software company and Intel as a, chip company. And so that's, I think, where the priorities come from, and that's the starting point. I also wanted to reiterate how important it is, the point you made, that there's incredible differences between the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the business unit, the CSR unit, the research unit, across the company, and they have different time investments. They have different ways of investing a period in education, and those things I think need to be really looked at more critically. And I think something moving forward is we need to look at each of these companies or foundations as unique actors. There is no single group, but thank you again for a fantastic presentation.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. And it's important to move away from the idea that all tech companies or all tech companies and all of their divisions and activities are the same, and we need to understand. I think it's very important, the distinction you're making between a chip company, hardware company, software company, because they do have different interests. I mean, it's at one level, I don't want to say this, but because it's too simplistic. But there is an obvious relationship between blended learning as a pedagogical technique and an organization of the classroom and the fact that Dell make computers. Blended learning rests upon having lots of computers in your classroom. You then also need lots of software. So they're enormously complex partnerships between Dell and software providers and MSDF and software providers in relation to blended learning. Incredibly complex, and with a colleague, Emiliano Grimaldi, we're looking at some of those. It involves an awful lot of work to actually get into those complexities, and again, which operates against the idea of a typology in a sense, because that is kind of easier in many ways than doing in-depth studies of particular companies or programs.
Okay, thank you. I have one online question. I want to read it to you. It probably is sufficient for another session. It reads, and how do we move forward in this new world of capitalism, make it more inclusive and democratic? This would require a few more hours, but maybe just to open up this discussion before we break up, because we're running out of time now.
Yeah. Well, I would want to respond to that by going back to the point I was making before about debate, but a debate which is not framed within the existing terms and language and sensibilities of the way that we think about education. That really we need a set of critical practices that create a space in which it is possible to think differently. So I want to move beyond the idea that we rearrange our existing thinking towards something that might be democratic, that we actually jettison all those notions about democracy and whatever in relation to education, use our critique to make contingent and fragile the current structure of philanthropy, and in that debris produced by that disruption of the existing thinking, that we actually start again to experiment with different ways of thinking, not new reorganized versions of the way we thought in the past. So I'm not arguing for the reconstruction of state education on the basis that it existed before the philanthropists became interested in it. I'm interested in moving to something that we cannot actually anticipate, so that I cannot suggest what that might look like. What I'm aiming to do is to create the possibility of a space within which the imagination of that alternative can be explored.
Thank you very much. Let me just...